1957, Jerry Lee Lewis was Sun Records' greatest money-making machine. But behind the spotlight lay a buried truth. The 22-year-old star had secretly married his 13-year-old cousin. When this legal risk threatened his international tour schedule, the music industry immediately launched a cover-up campaign. They forced a child to lie about their age and use forged documents to circumvent the law. Silence was bought with dollars, and morality was sold cheaply just to keep the idol from falling. But before he became a massive legal liability, he had to become an untouchable asset. Jerry Lee Lewis was born on September 29, 1935. By late 1957, he was the undisputed wild man of music. He pounded the piano keys with his feet. He set his instrument on fire. He was a force of nature earning thousands of dollars a night. He was the golden goose for an industry desperate to capitalize on the new youth culture. But his greatest deception happened far from the stage lights. When the reality of his domestic situation threatened to derail an international tour, his record label did not call the authorities. They did not contact child welfare services. They called their legal fixers. They looked at a 13-year-old girl and did not see a highly vulnerable individual. They saw a public relations nightmare and a threat to their revenue stream, deciding to neutralize that threat with systemic deception. The label's management made a choice. They instructed a young dependent to memorize a script built entirely on lies. They fabricated her age. They used falsified documents to bypass international customs. They committed cross-border misrepresentation to protect their most lucrative asset. The men in suits became active accomplices in the systemic manipulation of a minor. They used their power, their money, and their legal teams to shield a highly controversial figure. The music industry operates on a simple, ruthless equation. Profit dictates morality. When Jerry Lee Lewis walked into the Sun Records studio, he brought chaos, but he also brought cash. The executives tolerated his erratic behavior, his heavy drinking, and his volatile outbursts because the record sold. They turned a blind eye to his personal life. Memphis in the late 50s was a company town, and the company was in the business of making hits, not enforcing ethical standards. The executives knew the truth about Myra Gale Brown. They saw her playing in the living room and knew her exact date of birth. They watched their star artist exert control over a minor right in front of them. Yet, no producer stepped forward. No manager raised an objection. They watched a 22-year-old man pursue a girl who had not yet finished the 7th grade, and they calculated the financial risk. They determined that intervening would alienate their star. They chose the record sales over the safety of a child. This complicity went beyond passive observation. When the tour of the United Kingdom was booked, the stakes escalated. England was a massive, untapped market. The British press was notoriously aggressive. The executives knew they could not hide a 13-year-old companion from the reporters on Fleet Street. The legal age of consent in the UK was strictly enforced. Bringing Myra to London was a massive legal liability. Emergency meetings were immediately convened. Management confronted Lewis, demanding he leave the girl in Memphis, but his refusal was absolute. His arrogance was absolute. He believed his talent granted him immunity from the rules that governed ordinary citizens. He insisted she accompany him. The executives were faced with a dilemma: cancel the tour and lose millions, or break the rules to make it happen. They chose the latter. They initiated a damage control protocol. They pulled Myra into a closed room. They coached her. They instructed a 13-year-old girl to look foreign authorities and seasoned reporters directly in the eye and lie about her birth year. They told her to state she was 15. In the twisted logic of the 50s music business, 15 was a defensible scandal. 13 was legally indefensible. The deception required logistics. The industry fixers handled the damage control, ensuring the narrative held up just enough to get her on a transatlantic flight. They handed a young dependent a fabricated identity and pushed her in front of the cameras, orchestrating a massive public relations lie solely to protect a concert schedule. They marched Myra off the plane at Heathrow Airport. She wore adult clothing provided by the label, an attempt to age her up for the cameras. But the physical reality of a youth cannot be hidden by a mature dress. The British reporters swarmed immediately. They asked the exact questions the executives feared. Lewis smirked. He told them she was his wife. He told them she was 15. The lie engineered by the men in suits was arrogant and fragile. The reporters did not believe him. They made transatlantic phone calls. They checked public records in the American South. The truth was uncovered within hours. The headlines splashed across every newspaper in London. She was 13. She was his cousin. The industry cover-up collapsed. The British public revolted. Parliament debated his immediate deportation. The tour was canceled after 3 disastrous shows. The audiences threw coins and garbage at the stage. Lewis was chased out of the country. The industry executives who had orchestrated the misrepresentation retreated into the shadows. They abandoned the artist they had just risked everything to protect. The PR infrastructure collapsed, leaving industry executives scrambling to distance themselves from the immediate legal fallout. The explosion in London was merely the aftermath. The fuse was lit months earlier in the American South. This was not a spontaneous removal in the dead of night. It was a daylight operation. He leveraged the immense power imbalance between a global superstar and a middle school student. He used his status as a tool to bypass the legal system and override the fundamental boundaries of a family. The transgression began with a profound disregard for the law. Lewis was already married. His second wife was Jane Mitchum. He had filed for divorce, but the legal proceedings were incomplete. The paperwork was not finalized. He was legally bound to another woman. He did not care. The rules were an abstract concept to a man generating millions of dollars for a major record label. He viewed legal statutes as mere suggestions, obstacles easily bypassed by status and cash. He decided to take a third wife while the second was still legally his. He committed an unlawful second union. It was a calculated legal breach. He knew the risks, and he proceeded with absolute arrogance. The geography of the act was deliberate. In December 1957, Lewis loaded a 13-year-old girl into his black Cadillac. He drove her out of Tennessee and crossed state lines into Hernando, Mississippi. Hernando was notorious throughout the region. It was a recognized marriage mill. It was the destination for couples seeking to avoid waiting periods, blood tests, or uncomfortable questions from authorities. Lewis chose the location specifically for its lax oversight. The crossing of state borders with a minor to facilitate a highly questionable marriage elevated the act. It was a systematic evasion of jurisdiction. He was hunting for a blind spot in the legal system. They walked into the clerk's office at the county courthouse. Lewis stood before a government official and made a false declaration. He requested a marriage license. He filled out the official government paperwork. In the specific space designated for the bride's age, he wrote the number 20. It was a brazen, documented lie. The girl standing beside him possessed the round, unformed features of a child. She carried the physical demeanor of a junior high student. She wore clothes suited for a teenager, not a grown woman. Yet, the clerk stamped the document. The presence of a famous, wealthy musician blinded the local bureaucracy. The signature on the document was invalid. The marriage was compromised from the moment the ink dried on the page. Myra did not understand the gravity of the paperwork. She was a child. Lewis exploited this cognitive immaturity with clinical precision. He engaged in systematic emotional conditioning. He removed her from the 7th grade. He severed her connection to the educational system. He isolated her from her peers, her teachers, and any normal adolescent development. He replaced her textbooks with the highly volatile, chaotic environment of a touring rock musician. He influenced her heavily. He convinced a young dependent that serving a celebrity was a duty far superior to acquiring a basic education. He diverted her formative years. He ensured she would have no independent identity outside of his immediate control. She was conditioned to be an accessory, a silent fixture in his rapidly expanding empire. The most chilling aspect of this severe imbalance was its proximity to the victim's family. J.W. Brown was Myra's biological father. He was also Jerry Lee Lewis's cousin. More importantly, he was the bass player in Lewis's band. J.W. Brown's livelihood, his housing, and his future were entirely dependent on the man who was controlling his daughter. Lewis lived in the exact same house as the Brown family in Memphis. He conducted his operation under the father's roof. It was a breathtaking display of profound entitlement. Lewis believed his economic power neutralized parental authority. He believed he had bought the entire family, and therefore he owned everything inside the house. The secret could not hold. The tension in the house escalated until the truth surfaced. J.W. Brown discovered the falsified marriage license hidden in the residence. The piece of paper confirmed his worst suspicions. The man he worked for, the man he housed, the man he shared blood with, had taken his 13-year-old child and misrepresented state documents to claim her. The initial reaction was visceral. It was the primal response of a father recognizing a severe danger to his offspring. J.W. Brown bypassed the authorities. He walked directly to his bedroom and retrieved a weapon. He checked the mechanism. He ensured it was fully prepared. He walked through the house loudly declaring his intention to confront Jerry Lee Lewis. He intended to take drastic action against the man who had disrupted his family. The instinct was clear and uncompromising. He was pursuing the instigator in his own home. Lewis locked himself behind a heavy wooden door. He listened to the heavy boots pacing the floorboards outside. He listened to the mechanical sound of the weapon. He was cornered. He was terrified. But the confrontation never culminated. The intervention did not come from law enforcement. It came from the family unit itself. The extended family stepped between the enraged father and the locked door. They did not argue for the sanctity of human life. They argued survival. They reminded him that Jerry Lee Lewis was the sole financial pillar holding them above the grinding poverty they had just escaped. If he took action, the money stopped. The tours, the house, the entire new life would evaporate. J.W. Brown stood in the hallway. The weapon shook in his hand. He weighed his daughter's hardship against the financial security of his entire extended family. The father made his calculation. He lowered the weapon. The instinct to protect his child was ultimately crushed by the desperate need to keep the paycheck. The aftermath of that decision was an exhibition of total psychological surrender. The very next night, the band had a scheduled performance. J.W. Brown put on his tailored stage suit. He picked up his bass guitar. He walked out under the bright, blinding stage lights. He took his position directly behind Jerry Lee Lewis. The music started. J.W. Brown played the rhythm. He kept the beat perfectly. He watched the back of the man who was legally and physically controlling his daughter perform for screaming crowds. He smiled for the cameras. He bowed when the audience applauded. He collected his cut of the door money at the end of the night. The rebellion was crushed not by physical force, but by payroll. The father was completely neutralized. He became a compliant employee of the controlling figure, providing the baseline for his daughter's ongoing confinement. The flight back from London was not a retreat. It was an eviction. The international market slammed its doors shut. The British press had exposed the biological reality of the marriage. The American press immediately followed suit. The music industry operates on public perception, and the perception of Jerry Lee Lewis shifted overnight from a rebellious icon to a social pariah. The radio stations pulled his vinyl records from the broadcasting booths. Television producers canceled his scheduled appearances. The lucrative endorsement deals evaporated. The financial crash was instantaneous and brutal. A man who demanded $10,000 for a single arena performance was suddenly begging for $200 to play in rural dive bars. He lost the private planes. He lost the luxury tour buses. He was forced back into his own car, driving thousands of miles across state lines to play for hostile, drunken crowds. The empire was dismantled in a matter of weeks. He returned to Memphis. He returned to the house. He returned to the young dependent he had claimed as a wife. The magazines and tabloids attempted to soften the situation by utilizing the term youthful companion. It was a calculated phrase. It was designed to evoke a sense of misguided romance. It painted a picture of youthful rebellion against a strict society. The reality was devoid of romance. The reality was a highly restricted environment, protected by a questionable marriage license. Myra Gale Brown was not a traditional bride. She was a dependent. Jerry Lee Lewis constructed a sealed domestic environment. He took a middle school student and locked her inside an adult void. Lewis systematically severed her from every normal developmental milestone. By pulling her out of the 7th grade and terminating her education, he ensured she was left with no classmates, no peers, and completely isolated from any outside information or independent thought. Her entire worldview was violently compressed into the 4 walls of a house in Memphis. Her daily reality was dictated by the erratic, volatile moods of a disgraced and angry musician. While Lewis was on the road grinding out a living in the only venues that would accept him, Myra was left in isolation. She sat on the floor of a large, silent house. She played with paper dolls. She was a youth attempting to simulate childhood in a space-demanding adulthood. When the sound of tires crunched on the gravel driveway, the environment shifted instantly. The paper dolls were quickly gathered and hidden away. The child was forced to vanish. The wife was required to step forward. She had to manage the domestic duties of a household. She had to manage the psychological state of a man spiraling into heavy dependency. The international blacklist destroyed his ego, replacing the adulation of screaming crowds with the numb reliability of heavy substances. This chemical dependence shattered his nerves, morphing his rock star arrogance into an intense, destabilizing paranoia. Convinced the world was actively plotting his downfall, Lewis saw enemies in the shadows of his own property and began keeping various weapons close at hand. Hazardous items were reportedly hidden under sofa cushions, while others sat openly on kitchen counters and nightstands. Pacing the house, he would frequently cause highly disruptive and intimidating incidents to punctuate his arguments. This behavior subjected his young companion to a relentless campaign of severe emotional distress. She lived in a constant, paralyzing fear of sudden outbursts. She learned to read the sound of his footsteps. She learned to measure the level of danger by the specific cadence of his voice. She existed in a state of permanent hypervigilance. The inevitable reality of her situation soon caught up with her. Myra was expecting a child. She was still merely a young adolescent. Her physical development was far from complete. Medical historians note that the physical toll of maternity at such an early stage is immense. The psychological burden is often catastrophic. A developing youth found herself thrust into the overwhelming demands of motherhood. The medical system that treated her became complicit in the normalization of the situation. The professionals who examined the young, expectant mother did not alert welfare services. They did not contact the authorities. They looked at the questionable marriage certificate and accepted the narrative. They treated a highly questionable union as a standard marital event. They prioritized the legal paperwork over the biological age of the patient. When her son Steve Allen Lewis was born, the isolation became absolute. She was physically anchored to the house by an infant. She bore the entire weight of motherhood. She navigated the demands of a newborn while simultaneously managing the explosive temper of a heavily armed, paranoid individual. The house existed in a constant, volatile state of tension. 3 years later, the ultimate tragedy occurred. The toddler wandered out of the house. He fell into the family swimming pool. He drowned. The death of a child frequently fractures stable marriages. It shattered this volatile arrangement into jagged pieces. Lewis did not offer comfort. He did not share the grief. He utilized the tragedy as an instrument of control. He blamed her entirely. He accused her of severe negligence. He shifted the focus away from his own absentee parenting and his heavy substance use. He focused entirely on her failure as a mother. He punished her for a tragedy that occurred while he was incapacitated inside the house. The emotional pressure intensified exponentially. He crushed whatever fragile remnants of self-worth she still possessed. He convinced her the death was her fault. He ensured she remained trapped by guilt. For an entire decade, the mainstream pop music industry maintained the quarantine. Lewis remained a pariah. But capitalism operates without a moral compass. It operates strictly on the principle of supply and demand. It responds exclusively to profit. By the late 1960s, the cultural landscape had shifted. The British invasion dominated the pop charts. The youth culture had moved on to new idols. But the country music industry in Nashville operated on a different metric. Nashville was looking for raw, authentic emotion. They were looking for marketable comeback narratives. They were looking for established names that could guarantee record sales among older demographics. The executives at Smash Records looked at Jerry Lee Lewis. They did not see a man who had committed severe ethical breaches involving a minor. They did not see a man who had manipulated a youth, falsified government documents, and operated a highly restrictive household. They did not see a man completely destabilized by dependency and erratic behavior. They looked at the ledger. They saw a man who could sing a country ballad with convincing, marketable pain. They saw a voice that still possessed the power to generate millions of dollars in revenue. They made a calculated, bloodless business decision. They decided the 10-year penalty box was long enough. The public outrage had subsided. The memory of the London scandal had faded. They brought him into the recording studio. They stripped away the wild, aggressive rock and roll persona. They placed him behind a piano and instructed him to sing about regret, sorrow, and loss. He recorded a song titled Another Place, Another Time. The strategy worked perfectly. The song was a massive commercial success. It rapidly climbed the country music charts. The phone lines at radio stations across the nation lit up with requests. The audiences responded to the deep sadness in his voice. They mistook his self-inflicted misery for genuine, relatable hardship. They felt sympathy for the controversial figure. The Nashville establishment welcomed him back with open arms. They threw wide the heavy gates of the industry. The blacklist was officially incinerated. The record sales exploded globally. The massive arenas booked his tours again. The television networks invited him onto their primetime broadcasts. Corporate revenue rapidly surged back into his accounts. This was the ultimate capitalist pardon. The music industry did not merely overlook his actions against a young dependent. They monetized his disgrace. They rebranded the figure as a rugged, misunderstood survivor. They slapped the prestigious label of living legend onto a man who had derailed a young person's life and disrupted her development. The message sent by the executives in the boardroom was ruthless, transparent, and terrifying. The rules of human decency are highly flexible. If an artist retains the capacity to generate millions of dollars in corporate revenue, the system will actively forgive any transgression. The systemic manipulation of a 13-year-old girl was swept under the rug of chart-topping country music hits. The industry effectively buried his severe ethical violations beneath a steady stream of royalty checks. They proved that talent and profitability grant complete immunity from moral and social accountability. The Southern press was not an objective observer in this scandal. They were active participants in a calculated cover-up. When the disaster in London broke the news cycle and the outrage washed back onto American shores, the initial shock within the industry quickly gave way to a defensive strategy. The music business needed a shield to protect their investment. They found that shield in the regional newspapers and magazines of the American South. The editors, journalists, and public relations managers sitting behind heavy wooden desks in Memphis and Nashville made a collective, cynical decision. Hazardous items were reportedly hidden under sofa cushions, while others sat openly on kitchen counters and nightstands. Pacing the house, He would frequently cause highly disruptive and intimidating incidents to punctuate his arguments. This behavior subjected his young companion to a relentless campaign of severe emotional distress. She lived in a constant, paralyzing fear of sudden outbursts. She learned to read the sound of his footsteps. She learned to measure the level of danger by the specific cadence of his voice. She existed in a state of permanent hypervigilance. The inevitable reality of her situation soon caught up with her. Myra was expecting a child. She was still merely a young adolescent. Her physical development was far from complete. Medical historians note that the physical toll of maternity at such an early stage is immense. The psychological burden is often catastrophic. A developing youth found herself thrust into the overwhelming demands of motherhood. The medical system that treated her became complicit in the normalization of the situation. The professionals who examined the young expectant mother did not alert welfare services. They did not contact the authorities. The public eagerly accepted it. The media actively painted Myra Gale Brown as a mature, willing participant through carefully curated photographs. By forcing her to wear heavy makeup and adult clothing, while simultaneously manipulating the lighting and cropping images to hide her small stature, the press did everything within their power to visually erase the evidence of her youth. They interviewed locals who were on the industry payroll, generating vague, supportive quotes about young love and early maturity. They curated a fictional narrative of a modern Romeo and Juliet romance. They completely ignored the massive power imbalance. They ignored the familial conditioning. They ignored the hard legal statutes that were explicitly written to prevent this exact scenario. This media campaign was not just unethical journalism. It was a secondary form of systemic deception. It actively gaslit the individual. Myra was forced to read newspapers that validated her situation. She was told by the adult world, through the authority of the printing press, that her arrangement was normal. The media stripped her of her reality. They denied her the fundamental right to be recognized as a youth who had been manipulated by an adult. They locked her inside a false narrative just as securely as Lewis had kept her inside the house in Memphis. The press became the warden of her public perception. The lie of the Southern tradition was a smokescreen. It was a tactical distraction designed to keep the public looking away from the physical, irrefutable evidence. The hard evidence did not exist in rumors, cultural generalizations, or carefully lit photographs. The evidence existed in government filing cabinets. It consisted of two very specific, unalterable pieces of paper. These documents cut through the public relations spin with surgical precision. They are the ironclad proof of the reality. They strip away the rock and roll myth and leave only the cold mechanics of severe misrepresentation. The first document is the original birth certificate of Myra Gale Brown. It is a biological record. It is an objective fact of history. It details the exact day, month, and year she was pulled into the world. It records the names of her biological parents. It establishes her precise chronological existence. On the exact day she stood in the courthouse in Hernando, Mississippi, that piece of paper dictated that she had only been alive for 13 years. She had survived exactly 156 months. She was legally, biologically, and psychologically a youth. Her brain was not fully developed. Her body was not fully developed. No amount of media spin can age a human being faster than the passage of time. The birth certificate is the absolute, unyielding truth of her existence. The second document is the marriage license filed and stamped in the state of Mississippi. This document is a monument to deception. It is a legal contract built entirely on a foundation of brazen inaccuracy. It requires the signatures of the participants. It requires the declaration of age under the strict penalty of law. Jerry Lee Lewis stood before the county clerk. He looked at the line requiring the age of the bride. He held a pen in his hand. He did not write the number 13. He wrote the number 20. He committed a severe violation in that exact moment. He falsified a legal government document to facilitate the extreme manipulation of a minor. He misled the state to secure control of a young dependent. The juxtaposition of these two documents destroys the entire industry defense. Place the birth certificate directly next to the marriage license. The math is brutal and unforgiving. The numbers do not lie, nor do they care about hit records, sold-out arenas, or international fame. They simply confirm a harsh reality. A 22-year-old man falsified official government records to claim an arrangement with a 13-year-old dependent who also happened to be his cousin. The clerk who stamped that marriage license was complicit in the act. The local bureaucracy failed entirely. The system designed by the state to protect minors from manipulation looked at a famous, wealthy musician and abandoned its duty. The clerk saw youth. The clerk saw the inaccuracy written on the paper. The clerk stamped it anyway. The ink dried. The lie became a legal reality. The state of Mississippi officially sanctioned the union because the individual arrived in a Cadillac and possessed a recognizable face. The system capitulated to celebrity status. The media never published the birth certificate next to the marriage license. They deliberately hid the math from their readers. They focused the public attention entirely on the music. They demanded the public separate the art from the artist. They argued that his personal life should not overshadow his musical contributions. But the art was actively funded by the situation. The tours were organized around the cover-up. The entire infrastructure of Jerry Lee Lewis's career was built on the premise that he was above the rules. The music and the extreme exploitation were inextricably linked. The revenue generated by the piano playing paid for the house where the dependent was kept in isolation. A hit song on the Billboard charts does not bend ethical reality. A platinum record does not alter the biological timeline of a developing youth. The ability to play the piano with aggressive, entertaining speed does not grant immunity from severe ethical standards. The music industry attempted to use his talent as a permanent pass. They succeeded in keeping him insulated. They succeeded in maintaining his wealth and his status. But they cannot change the historical record. The paperwork remains in the archives, outlasting the executives and the journalists who tried to bury it. The historical record demands a cold, emotionless verdict. Jerry Lee Lewis was not a misunderstood genius. He was not a rebel pushing against the restrictive boundaries of a conservative society. Rebellion targets authority. Rebellion challenges established power structures. Jerry Lee Lewis did not challenge power. He exploited the powerless. He targeted a subordinate. He exerted intense pressure on a highly vulnerable dependent within his own family structure. That is not rebellion. That is severe manipulation. History must call him exactly what the documents prove him to be. He was a controlling figure who used his immense wealth and cultural influence to evade accountability. He operated a highly restrictive environment. He disrupted the critical developmental years of a young girl. He compromised her father by turning him into a paid accomplice. He compromised the record label executives who orchestrated the massive cover-up for him. He compromised the journalists who wrote narratives to defend him. His legacy is a sprawling, toxic web of systemic enablers and harm. The music is secondary to the reality. The rhythm is drowned out by the absolute silence of the accountability system. The documents remain in the archives, waiting for the world to finally read the math and deliver the verdict that the industry refused to pronounce. The illusion of absolute control is the fatal flaw of every controlling figure. Jerry Lee Lewis constructed a domestic fortress designed to be impenetrable. He utilized fear, financial dependency, and physical isolation to maintain his grip on a young dependent. He believed the emotional conditioning was permanent. He believed the industry shielding him from scrutiny would also shield him from the consequences of his own actions. He was wrong. The system protected him from immediate fallout, but it could not protect him from the inevitable maturation of the individual he kept close. In 1970, the architecture of the Memphis arrangement finally collapsed. Myra Gail Brown filed for divorce. She was no longer a 13-year-old middle school student staring blankly at a questionable marriage license. She was 26 years old. She had spent exactly half of her time on Earth tethered to a volatile individual. She had survived the catastrophic drowning of her young son. She had survived the daily, grinding tension of navigating a house filled with weapons and paranoid delusions. She had reached the absolute limit of human endurance. Her departure violently dismantled the public relations narrative that the music industry had spent a decade carefully cultivating. The legal documents she filed in the proceedings did not mince words. She did not cite irreconcilable differences. She cited severe emotional and psychological hardship. She swore under oath that she had been subjected to severe systemic harm. The court records laid the reality bare for the public record. The media's sanitized, folksy narrative of a youthful Southern romance was permanently replaced by the cold clinical terminology of domestic instability and extreme emotional pressure. Lewis did not surrender his authority willingly. Men who rely on total domination viewed departure not as a personal failure, but as a theft of control. He threatened her. He attempted to intimidate her. He deployed the exact same tactics of emotional distress that had kept her paralyzed for 13 consecutive years. But the mechanism was broken. The indoctrination had worn off. She looked at the aging, substance-dependent musician and no longer saw an untouchable deity. She saw a profoundly unstable and deeply troubled man. She walked out the door. She took her surviving daughter. She left behind the sprawling real estate, the stockpiled weapons, and the legacy of the hit records. She walked away from the immense wealth generated during her own isolation. She walked away from the entire corporate ecosystem that had enabled her situation. Rebuilding a functional life after a diverted childhood is a brutal, unforgiving process. Myra was forced to learn how to exist in a society she had been actively hidden from since the 7th grade. She had to figure out how to operate as an independent adult when she had never been granted the right to be a normal teenager. She went to work. She became a real estate agent. She forged an identity entirely separate from the man who had overshadowed her original one. She took her life back day by day, entirely outside the shadow of the music business. Her survival is the only authentic victory in this entire narrative. She outlived the scandal. She outlived the man who took her youth. Lewis continued his destructive descent. The departure of the individual he controlled did not trigger a moment of self-reflection or rehabilitation. It only accelerated his volatile trajectory. The pattern of instability and tragedy did not end when Myra walked out the door. He married several more times. The outcomes of these subsequent relationships were catastrophic and deeply disturbing. 2 of his later wives passed away under highly scrutinized circumstances. Sharon Gunn Pate drowned in a swimming pool at a home they owned. Years later, Sean Stevens passed away from a fatal substance incident in a guest bedroom. Authorities investigated the scenes. Grand juries were convened in the state of Mississippi. Startling evidence of severe physical distress and intense domestic turmoil was presented. The circumstances mirrored the darkest chapters of his past behavior, yet the celebrity shield held firm. The authorities declined to proceed with formal charges. He avoided accountability once again. The system blinked in the face of wealth and fame. The music industry observed these mounting tragedies and made their standard calculation. They continued to book his shows. They continued to issue his royalty checks. The dark, highly concerning cloud hovering over his personal life was treated by promoters as an eccentric rock and roll footnote rather than a terrifying documented pattern of harm against women. The corporate system protected the revenue stream until the very end of his life. They prioritized the sale of concert tickets over the safety of the women residing in his home. History demands a rigorous and uncompromising reckoning. We can no longer look at the archival black and white footage of Jerry Lee Lewis hammering a piano without directly acknowledging the horrific price paid for that performance. The manic, aggressive energy displayed on the stage was fueled by the exact same psychological intensity that destabilized a household. The music and the reality are inseparable. The revenue generated by the piano playing directly funded the house where the young dependent was kept in isolation. The art was subsidized by the severe ethical violations. The executives at Sun Records who falsified the documents are gone. The reporters who wrote the narratives defending the marriage are gone. Jerry Lee Lewis is dead, but the objective truth does not die with the enablers. The truth remains filed in the archives. It sits in government filing cabinets in Mississippi and Tennessee. These documents are completely immune to public relations campaigns. They do not care about Grammy Awards. They do not care about inductions into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. They do not listen to the music. The birth certificate explicitly states she was born in 1944. The marriage certificate explicitly states they were wed in 1957. The math is simple, brutal, and entirely unforgiving. 13 years. Jerry Lee Lewis did not just break a young dependent. He exposed the ruthless machinery of an entire industry. His story strips away the glamorous facade of entertainment to reveal a cold truth. It serves as undeniable proof that a culture will actively ignore the most glaring violations of ethical standards if the violator provides a sufficient level of entertainment. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that the art we consume is often built upon the silent struggles of hidden individuals. This is a story about a father who compromised his daughter's safety to maintain his employment in a band. It is a story about corporate businessmen who falsified international travel documents to protect a lucrative tour schedule. It is a story about journalists who weaponized cultural stereotypes to shield a highly controversial figure from severe scrutiny. There is absolutely no romance to be found in this history. There is no youthful rebellion to celebrate. There is only a 22-year-old man, a 13-year-old girl, and the complicit silence of a massive industry that collectively decided her life was an acceptable price to pay for a hit record. The applause eventually stops. The records fade into static. But the ink on the birth certificate never ages. 13 years old. That is the only legacy that matters.